if you have been here for a little while, you know I'm a big fan of red light therapy. I have made quite a few videos on the incredible benefits of red light therapy, which we know at this point go way beyond skin rejuvenation. In fact, in today's video, I am talking to my good friend, Bev Sanderson, who is not just the founder of one of my favorite skincare companies, my sauna, but a red light therapy expert, especially when it comes to skin rejuvenation. However, in today's video, Bev and I are going to explore the potential benefits red light therapy has to offer when it comes to improving sleep quality. Bev, it's wonderful to have you back.
Lovely to be back. Thank you for having me, Claudie.
You're so welcome. I always love talking to you. You are such a wealth of knowledge in general when it comes to skincare, but also when it comes to red light therapy. Now, of course, as I mentioned in my intro, you're an expert on red light therapy for skin rejuvenation. But in today's video, we're diving a bit deeper and are talking about the benefits of red light therapy for sleep, which I think is something many people are really struggling with nowadays, me included. So let's start really briefly. Maybe you can tell us why sleep is so important and what the impact of not getting enough sleep, what's the impact on our health?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there are so many people out there struggling with sleep quality, maybe you and I included. And it's absolutely critical for our health and well-being. I mean, sleep impacts on every organ in our body, every system in our body, you know, from the brain to the heart, to cell metabolism, to the immune function. It's absolutely critical. I sympathize with anybody out there who is struggling with sleep deprivation. You know, lack of sleep has really a systemic negative effect on our body, doesn't it? We wake up in the morning, we feel groggy, we're not as alert as we should be, we're not as productive as we should be. And that's just really if we have a bad night's sleep. You know, over the longer term, it can start to impact on our mental acuity, it increases inflammation, and it can even lead to weight gain in the body. There's various considerations, and then there's other people that perhaps would consider that they're an insomniac. They literally have chronic sleep deprivation, and that can lead to long-term health problems, and even neurodegenerative diseases are a higher risk if people are struggling with chronic sleep deprivation. So, you know, sleep is critical to our health and well-being.
Talking about insomnia, I have been there. I had a year when my hormones were imbalanced where I could not sleep. But not just does that affect our health, but it affects relationships, it affected my work. It really affects everything in our life.
It affects so much, yeah. And I certainly myself, you know, have periods of time when I don't sleep well at all. Then I seem to get back into a pattern and then something disrupts that again. But I wouldn't say that I'm a chronic insomniac, but I certainly do have trouble sleeping at times.
So Bev, we are hearing more and more about light affecting our day-to-day living. There's a lot of talk about getting daylight first thing in the morning and avoiding blue light at night. In your opinion, what impact does light have on our health and well-being, as well as our sleep cycle?
It plays a central role for sure, and different light has a different effect on the body. Our bodies have this internal body clock. In fact, our brain regulates the circadian rhythm, and it responds to changes in light in our environment. And I think modern day lives kind of get in the way because it doesn't allow our brain to necessarily receive those natural signals from the environment. We're surrounded by bright lights, we're surrounded by screens which interfere with circadian rhythm. So, you know, if we look at our hormones, certain hormones that control our sleep cycle are affected by light. So when we wake up in the morning, we've got a high level of cortisol, and then that's at its very lowest when we're in a deep sleep. So cortisol really regulates our wakefulness. And then in contrast to that, we have the other hormone, which is melatonin, which is secreted by the pineal gland. So the pineal gland recognizes when the light starts to dim and that absence of blue light, and that's when it starts to secrete melatonin, and then melatonin increases our drowsiness and wanting to go to sleep and stay asleep. So it's really important to have that balance between the cortisol and the melatonin, but the blue light gets in the way. We should have plentiful blue light in the morning, and then in early evening that blue light's disappeared, the light's dimming, and then that's when our circadian rhythm works really well. So we talked about different lights having different impacts. They've looked at the effect of white light, and white light can interfere with our circadian rhythm, because what is white light? Well, it's the whole rainbow of lights, isn't it? It's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet. It's all of those shades of light. So blue light and green light is contained within white light, and it can affect the circadian rhythm. But red light and the longer wavelengths, they don't impact on melatonin levels in the blood. They don't impact on our circadian rhythm. So red lights, that's why we might have historically sat in front of a fire, when we were cavemen, and that was fine. That would help us to sort of feel drowsy and go to sleep. So yes, the different lights are really, really important in our sleep cycle.
So personally, when I live in a dark climate, when I lived in France and the sun in winter didn't come up till 9:30 in the morning, I had a blue light box that I would turn on first thing in the morning to help my body get that cortisol rise. And then at night, even though my husband, to this day, I've done this for years now, he still makes fun of me every night. I wear blue blockers. I wear orange glasses because we do want to watch a television show or something together. So I wear those orange glasses to block the blue light. So personally, I definitely know there's a difference as far as blue light stimulation. If I get blue light stimulation at night, it does keep me alert and it makes it harder to go to sleep.
Me too.
But it will be really interesting to hear from you. How does red light therapy affect our alertness, sleep cycle, circadian rhythm, all of those things?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that red light does not suppress melatonin. When you start to look at the literature, believe me, it can get a little bit contradictory. And I went down a rabbit hole with this. Does it actually increase melatonin in the blood and make us feel sleepy? Or does it just not have any effect at all? And there are contradictory studies. So if we look at, there was some work done by Figueroa in 2015 where he was looking at white light and the effect of white light on shift workers. And that was what I was referring to when I said about white light being the whole spectrum of colours. And that white light really did affect their productivity. But what they found there was that the red light increased their alertness, but it didn't suppress the melatonin in the blood and therefore did not affect their circadian rhythm. So that was the important part from that study. But there's also another study, which I love because, there's very few studies you find in healthy individuals, because generally when they're doing studies, they're kind of looking at, is this the cure for something? So it's quite hard sometimes to find studies on healthy individuals. But there was a fantastic study done in 2019 by the Chinese Institute of Sports Science, where they looked at a whole team of basketball players, female basketball players.
I remember that study. Yep, I've actually quoted that study,
Yeah, so they looked at the impact of red light therapy on sleep quality and endurance performance of these athletes. So in this study, there were 20 individuals, and of course they had to split that in half. So 10 of them would have been treated with red light therapy and the other half received a sham light, as they call it. So effectively they're lying on this red light therapy bed, which is a little bit like a tanning bed, and they get a 30-minute treatment before they go to sleep. This was repeated for 14 days. And then after that 14-day treatment, they then had to do a run for 12 minutes and they measured their improvement in performance. But those that were treated with the red light, interestingly, reported an improvement in sleep quality. And this was measured by the equivalent of the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, but the Chinese version of that, effectively. So it was scored and there was a definite improvement in their sleep quality. And also the serum melatonin as well in the red light group, not in the placebo group. So that I find that a really interesting study because it's the only one I've seen where we've actually seen an increase in the serum melatonin after treatment with red light. Now, these are healthy individuals, and most studies are around individuals that perhaps have trouble sleeping or are insomniacs or have some other medical condition. So maybe we see a slightly different situation here, or maybe this is what goes on, but we just haven't seen it in other studies.
And these were also young individuals. So I think the age might also make a difference. Yeah. And you said that they had improved sleep quality and they had improved performance. And I talked about this too when I quoted the study. Of course, we don't know, did they have improved performance because they slept better, or are these two separate benefits they got?
That's so true.
It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's interesting that they could measure an increase in melatonin, which to me seems a bit strange, because if we're thinking of the sun, right, in the morning, we also get red light stimulation when the sun comes up. So one would think that you don't get an increase in melatonin.
I could get really nerdy here, because melatonin is an antioxidant, and inside the cells, obviously it helps to fight free radicals. And melatonin we tend to think of melatonin as the hormone that's secreted by the pineal gland, but that is melatonin in the blood, and that's what makes us feel sleepy. Now, red light definitely helps with melatonin production, but it's intracellular. It doesn't go into the blood, and that is the difference. So, I've read or listened to various reports around how red light can increase melatonin, but it's intracellular. So that doesn't affect us feeling sleepy necessarily.
Okay. Let's go back to that study we just talked about. These were obviously healthy individuals, young, healthy individuals.
Yes.
Is there any evidence to suggest that red light therapy could be beneficial for people with sleep issues?
Yes. I mean, I think sleep issues, obviously there's various degrees of sleep issues, aren't they? But if we start with people just having trouble sleeping generally, not necessarily sleep issues, but just have trouble sleeping, there is actually an interesting review that was published just last year, and they were using this red light and near infrared collar. And in both groups that had the treatment, because of course there was a sham collar as well, in both groups that had the treatment, they reported an improvement in their quality of sleep. The data is not wholly conclusive though, because both active and sham users improved in insomnia severity index, ISI, score by the end of the trial. So there could be an element of the sham light providing a psychological benefit for sleeping. Nonetheless, the reported improvements in sleep in the red light group is interesting.
These were people with just sleep problems. What about somebody with insomnia, actually?
Yes, so we should probably define insomnia. What do we mean by insomnia? Well, insomnia is that medical term that describes difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, and also affects your performance the next day. So it's that degree higher, isn't it? And absolutely, yes, there is evidence around low-level light therapy or photobiomodulation improving sleep quality in insomniacs. What we have seen for chronic insomniacs, low-level light therapy appears to shorten the sleep latency. That's the time taken to fall asleep. It reduces the number of awakenings during the night, and it improves sleep efficiency. And this is supported by a trial that was carried out in Taiwan by Shen in 2019. That's a single-blinded, randomized controlled trial in humans using laser acupuncture.
That's quite hopeful to people with insomnia. Now, just to backtrack a tiny bit, you mentioned photobiomodulation and low light laser, which all fall under the umbrella of red light therapy, but you like to say photobiomodulation, which I appreciate because it includes red light and infrared light, correct?
Photobiomodulation, red light therapy, low-level light therapy, they're all different terms effectively for the same thing. But I think what's important for your audience to understand is that we're generally talking about red and near infrared light therapy when we're talking about any of those three things.
So going back to this trial really briefly, you mentioned low-level laser acupuncture, which I'm not familiar with. So how was that administered?
So this was laser acupuncture. So effectively, it's like when they put a cannula into your arm and then shine red light therapy.
That's something that's not easily accessible to most of us, unfortunately. Are there
but any I don't think that matters. I think if we take these things too literally, then we would say, oh, well, I can't do that and I can't do that. what we're trying to see is, does red light have an impact? How it's administered may not be that important.
Having heard from some of my viewers, anecdotal evidence is definitely there. Many of them have told me that they use the red light panels at night and it has improved the quality of their sleep. So it is definitely something that seems to help people quite a bit.
Yes, yeah. I think a lot of these things obviously start with medical studies, but we've progressed, haven't we, from, lasers to LEDs. And if we sit there sort of looking at all the science papers and saying, well, that was done with a laser, therefore it doesn't apply, we wouldn't be using LEDs at home. So clearly we're not going to be able to replicate medical applications in that sense. We're not going to be able to do laser acupuncture. But I don't know that is the takeaway here. The takeaway here is, did red and near infrared light have an impact? Yes, it did. It improved sleep quality. And that's really the takeaway. So what are we using at home? We're using LEDs.
So as you just mentioned, insomnia is kind of difficult to define. But what about other conditions that can affect sleep? For example, restless leg syndrome.
That's a really good one. I'm glad you mentioned that, because there is a study around restless leg syndrome, and the group that had the red light treatment definitely had a significant improvement in sleep quality after the 4-week treatment. Not only that, but it extended well beyond the treatment. So for another 4 weeks beyond that, they measured their sleep quality and it was still holding up. It was still much better than before the treatment. And there was a control group and they didn't see any improvement. So I think that is a really good study. That was with 650 and 890 nanometer LED. This is LED, you'll be glad to know. 25 participants in this study. In fact, there were 2 studies. So they did it, first of all, with red and near infrared. And then the second study was just near infrared alone. Both were randomized trials, 4 weeks treatment, and then 4 weeks follow-up. So that's really positive, actually, for the restless leg syndrome. And I think you mentioned to me that that's something that you get occasionally, is it? Restless leg syndrome?
I do, and it drives me crazy.
Okay, so there's one for you, and then there's one for me, because you know that I have this temporal mandibular dysfunction, I have TMD, and that really is as a result of grinding my teeth, or clenching my jaw. So that is sleep bruxism. And there's also studies around red light therapy and sleep bruxism. These studies were actually done in children. I don't know why they were done in children. Would it be more of an issue in children than it is in adults? I'm not sure. But again, it had very, very positive results. And I actually do think that the red light therapy has helped my TMD considerably. My jaw didn't open more than 2 centimeters, and I was eating liquid food for some time. And it has repaired itself.
Wow. And you do red light therapy quite frequently?
Yeah, I do red light therapy at least 5 times a week.
I looked at studies where red light therapy was used in the treatment of dementia, which was a very promising, very small, but very promising study. I've also looked at some as far as depression. What can you tell us about that? Any evidence that suggests that red light therapy can be beneficial for, let's say, anxiety, depression, neurological diseases such as dementia,
migraine, Alzheimer's? Yeah, the list goes on. Honestly, Cloudy, there is a shed load of information out there. There's a red light therapy database of papers with over 6,000 papers on there. So you can look at, sleep apnea, sleep bruxism, sleep in general, and it will pull up a lot of papers where they've been looking to treat something else with red light therapy, and the end result is an improvement in sleep quality. We've seen that around anxiety. We've seen that around migraines. And then there's some data around Alzheimer's, which is a subject really close to my heart because my dad had Alzheimer's. So this was a study performed in China by the Alzheimer's Association. And the thing with Alzheimer's is that you get this atrophy of the frontal cortex, and that is due to a lack of oxygen in the brain. So this study shows that the red light improves the oxygen consumption. That then helped their memory function. It was a pretty impressive study, actually, because the red light therapy was only administered over 5 days. After just 5 days, they saw an improvement in memory function.
First of all, I'm really sorry. I didn't know about your dad, so I'm really sorry about that. And you mentioned that the red light therapy increased the oxygen flow in the brain.
Yeah.
I remember looking at the study regarding red light therapy and dementia. And at the end, they were talking about how they are realizing now that neurological diseases also has to do with the lack of ATP in the brain cells. Yes. And of course, we know red light therapy does both. It increases the flow of oxygen and it increases ATP production.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's quite hopeful.
Yeah.
What's also interesting is the studies you just quoted were done to see if red light therapy helps with anxiety, depression, neurological diseases. And it did help with those ailments. But on top of it, it also helped improve sleep quality, which is quite promising.
Yes, and there's more. It won't come as any surprise that a lot of people use red light therapy for pain relief. And there are some interesting studies around musculoskeletal disorder and how using red light therapy, not just to treat the pain, but improve the sleep quality of these patients.
Again, what's so interesting is that red light therapy seems to improve these various conditions on top of sleep, but maybe it's because sleep is improved that these various conditions also improve. So we don't know what was there first, the chicken or the egg.
Yeah, but we'll take it either way.
Exactly.
It doesn't really matter. It's a double whammy, isn't it?
Exactly. Now, going back to neurological diseases really quickly, I think it's a subject that many of us are interested in. Photobiomodulation during sleep is explored as a potential treatment for brain diseases such as Alzheimer's and even Parkinson's.
This is a really exciting new area of research. So what they're learning is that the sleeping brain, has this waste management system. And what it does is it clears out all the toxins from the central nervous system. And so during that time, it allows the central nervous system to repair itself. So the sleeping brain is absolutely critical to our central nervous system. And this exploratory area of research is using photobiomodulation to improve the brain's waste management system. So we have lymphatic vessels in the brain. They're an important part of this waste management system. And what they've found is that these lymphatic vessels in certain diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, they're not working effectively. And when they introduce the red light therapy, which will be transcranial, so here we're talking about red light on the head and having that treatment while somebody is sleeping, that is helping the brain to improve its removal of waste from the central nervous system. And then that has an impact, a sort of neuroprotective impact on the central nervous system. It's a really, really exciting area of research.
So it all comes back to sleep every time. Any of these diseases, yeah, everything we just talked about, it all comes back to improving quality of sleep.
Sleep is everything, isn't it? We don't function well without a good night's sleep. And, so many people that suffer with chronic sleep deprivation, it impacts on their health and well-being as a whole. And potentially, long-term sleep deprivation is an increased risk of these neurodegenerative diseases and other conditions. So a good night's sleep is so important.
You said you use red light therapy quite frequently, at least 5 days a week. Have you, and it's probably difficult to say because it is something you do regularly, but do you think you have noticed any benefits using it as far as improving the quality of your sleep?
I mean, I do have problems with sleeping, and those are, typically work related. My brain just gets too busy, or I work too late. I've definitely seen an impact there. I think one thing I have tried experimentally, which I believe has worked for me, is if I work late, I know that I've kind of increased my blue light exposure. So I try to counteract that by doing a red light therapy treatment before bed. Now, ordinarily, I do my red light therapy in the morning. It's just something I like to wake up to. I use it for skin rejuvenation. But I think, if you're using it in the evening, then ideally you should use a slightly dimmer light because you don't want to overstimulate the brain with bright light. So, top tips to pass on. We should be looking at doing any kind of red light therapy at least 2 hours before bed. I wouldn't say, lie in bed with your red light therapy mask and expect to fall asleep. For me personally, it doesn't work that way. And I think bright light intervention is not necessarily the right way to go right before sleep. But a couple of hours before, again, reflecting how we were from our origins, sitting in front of a fire, that's when you would have your exposure to red light, isn't it? It's when the sun goes down, you see that sunset, you're sitting in front of a fire. You haven't got my panel yet.
I haven't gotten it yet. I'm very excited.
And on the panel, we have 4 buttons, and the last one is ambient. Now, I'm not going to blind everybody, but if the panel was on, you can see with the last button that you can reduce the intensity right down to 25%. So that's not too bright. So, just a 10-minute treatment, early evening. I would just encourage people to try and see whether it improves their sleep quality. We don't have any specific data around that. As you know, we're experts, if you like, in the skin rejuvenation space, and we've spent a considerable amount of time optimizing protocols for skin rejuvenation. And I developed my panel with pulse light for skin rejuvenation benefits. Now, you don't need to use the pulse light, that's optional, but pulse light does bring benefits for skin rejuvenation. We've seen that it increases the amount of ATP over regular red light. It accelerates proliferation of dermal fibroblasts. It also helps to increase the penetration of red light. So, there are many benefits for pulse light. Do those apply to sleep optimization? I don't believe they do. I haven't seen studies around pulse light for sleep optimization. I think if you were using it for sleep optimization, I would use it in the non-pulsed mode and just encourage you to dim the light and try it that way. So it's just ambient red light. So you're reducing your exposure to white light and to blue light particularly, and just getting that exposure to red light that helps to calm the brain and reoxygenate the brain and increase ATP. It maintains alertness but doesn't suppress melatonin production, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
So you would say 10 minutes in the early evening, kind of when the sun would go down, so you're sort of mimicking a sunset or a fire. Yeah. This is probably a silly question, but would you keep your eyes open or close them?
I personally would still, it depends what you were doing. If you were lying down in bed and you were a distance away, then I would still close my eyes. If I was using it in combination of, well, I'm doing my skin rejuvenation treatment anyway, I would still wear goggles, because I think that you're probably sat 9 to 12 inches away from the device, and it's still bright light. So you want to reduce your exposure to bright light, particularly if you're using it in the evening. So we've discussed about red light and near infrared light, whether it's beneficial to eyes or not. I still think that you should wear goggles in the evening, regardless of health benefits to eyes. You should still wear goggles in the evening because you don't want exposure to bright light.
And as some of the studies showed, where it was administered internally, obviously we don't have to look into the light to get the benefits. So that makes sense. This has to hit our system somehow.
Yes, there are no optimized protocols for sleep quality. There just aren't. We've looked at a bunch of studies today, and they've used different applications in terms of transcranial, intravenous. We've seen masks, we've seen goggles, we've seen sleeping beds. So we can't sit there and say this is the exact way to do it and this is how you're going to get a benefit. What we do know is that red light does not interfere with your circadian rhythm. That's the most important thing. And it may have a beneficial effect on melatonin. It may. Does it help sleep quality? I think we can absolutely say yes. Look at all of these studies where every one of these studies has a positive result for an improvement in sleep quality. And I think that is the main takeaway from this video.
Both you and I are going to try it. We're going to adjust because, like you, I do my red light therapy in the morning usually, but I'm definitely after doing this video, I'm definitely going to adjust too and see what happens.
Yeah. And we'd love feedback from your viewers as well. Are they finding improvements in sleep quality?
Yes, definitely. If anybody notices a difference in sleep quality, let us know down below. As always, Bev, this was wonderful. It's always such a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Claudia. It's always nice to be back. You know why it is? joking apart, it's because I've been using my laser comb, and if you look at it, I have got
you have new hair growth. Yeah,
so that's why it's sticky uppy.
Did they also improve on? Did they also?
Just threw that in.